If you're watching this channel, it's because you don't enjoy watching the world squander what Christendom built, but you want to do your part. And chances are you've heard me mention a great means by doing just that. Email made by and for Catholics. Check out fidei.email. That's FIDEI.email. Built for Catholic individuals, families, organizations, and groups. They're private, secure, and of course, they're Catholic. And they're offering 2 months off on your first year for an annual subscription if you enter the coupon code Return to Tradition without spaces. That's the name of this channel, without spaces, at checkout. Amazingly, and I do mean amazingly, Pope Francis will speak really candidly in what actually oftentimes sounds like really nice Catholic ways with priests, unless you're paying attention to what he's actually saying. But he'll speak rather candidly when he goes on these international trips of his to speak with priests in the local countries. And in Singapore, he spoke with the local Jesuit priests. And they asked him a bunch of rather important questions. I'm going to only focus on 2 of these here because they're rather incredible, his answers. One of which is he makes an admission, and it's a stunning admission. He admits that there were many in the church who thought that he would be a disaster of a pope, and said openly that he would be when he won the conclave, when his peers elevated him to the See of Peter. He admits that. That's incredible. He also admits what his vision for the church is, and it really won't surprise you much. But he does say so in these terms that are more blunt with the priest he's speaking with than he might otherwise say to the media. Now, these were published not on some independent news site, not on some independent blog or on Twitter by a Catholic reporter, even though those are great sources for information of what's going on in the church. This was published in La Civiltà Cattolica, the Jesuit, official Jesuit news arm of Vatican City, of Rome. This was in an unequivocally Jesuit outlet. They speak the party line when it comes to the news in Rome. It's an incredible admission. And their article is published with this headline: Onward with Courageous Prudence. Pope Francis in conversation with Jesuits in Indonesia, East Timor, and Singapore. Here we get a question that leads to a stunning admission. He admits that there were people who knew he would be a disastrous pope, that he would be a revolutionary agent within the church. And a lot of this is framed in the changes to the Jesuits that happened starting in the 60s. Because it was in the 60s that you started seeing Jesuits overtly experimenting with liberation theology. Now, I say overtly because when you read the history of liberation theology, it goes back decades to the 1920s. But the Jesuits were always central to that story. It was in the 1960s that they stopped hiding it, and that they started imposing this on the Jesuit order, including in official decrees that said that the main mission of the Jesuits now was to correct injustices as they and their secular handlers saw it. That's what the mission of the Jesuits became. And yes, there are still good Jesuits in the church, a few of them, and signs point to the seminaries being full of young Jesuit men who are concerning to the Jesuits running the place now because they actually have the Catholic faith and are more traditionally minded as Jesuits. So it's a good sign. But remember, the Jesuits have been revolutionary change agents for decades. And here is Francis kind of admitting that. His response to the question. Quote, being Pope is a cross just like yours is a cross. You all have your own cross. The Lord accompanies you, consoles you, gives you strength. Many times you have to pray a lot to have the light for decisions. But this everyone has to do. A very beautiful thing is to see how the Lord speaks to you through people, speaks to you through those who are able to pray best, the simple people. Even the parish priest has his collaborators, as does the Pope, and the Pope has to listen a lot. I then try not to lose my sense of humor. This is really important. A sense of humor is healthy. Maybe I am exaggerating, but being a pope is no more difficult nor very different than being a priest, a nun, a bishop. In short, it means being in the place where the Lord has put you, following your vocation. It is not a penance. In my case, I went to the conclave and did my calculations, and I thought that the Pope will be chosen soon and he will not take possession in Holy Week, which would then be the next one. That's why I booked the return ticket on Saturday before Palm Sunday, so that I would be in the diocese for the celebration. I had left the homilies for Holy Week already prepared. I did not expect it, therefore. That's the way you do things. You move forward as the Lord wills. I read in a book by journalist Gerard O'Connell that when I was elected, one cardinal said to another of me, "This is going to be a disaster. The Lord will tell if I have been a disaster." End quote. I think anyone with eyes can see has seen that he has been a disaster. That some of us suspect that he's a chastisement from God, and that he is the fulfillment of the prophecy of St. Francis of Assisi, that there would be one associated with the order of the Franciscans who was made pope in a non-canonical way, and that he would be a destroyer as a chastisement sent. It's a sobering thought to think about, but to call him a disaster is to put it mildly, to look at the effect he has had on the church and the heresies that he has allowed to flourish, that will flourish long after he is gone, unless we get a truly holy pope who is willing to do unpleasant, necessary things to restore order in the church. Now, part and parcel of all of that, though, is Francis being asked by those priests, those Jesuit priests, what he believes his vision for the church is. What is Francis's vision? And you will not be surprised to hear him say, it's synodality. Because of course it's synodality. Remember, synodality means listening and dialogue and lukewarmness and not really evangelizing and not really spreading the gospel to bring souls to Christ, but listening to everyone else and bringing and sharing your ideas so we can all get a better idea of God together. That's right out of Pascendi, by the way, Pope Pius X's landmark encyclical condemning the errors of the modernists, defining modernism as the synthesis of all heresies. Synodality is right out of that playbook and overtly condemned by Pope St. Pius X. But here's Francis's response. Quote, "The synod we are conducting is on synodality. The Synod of Bishops was born from an insight of St. Pope Paul VI because the Western Church had lost the dimension of synodality, while the Eastern Church had preserved it. Paul VI, at the end of the council, created the Secretariat for the Synod of Bishops so that all bishops would have a synodal dimension of dialogue. In 2001, I was at the Synod of Bishops. I was collecting the material and arranging it. The Secretary of the Synod would go through it and say to take out this or that item that had been approved by a vote of the various groups. There were things that he didn't think were appropriate, and he would say to me, 'No, there will be no vote on that, no vote on this.' It was not understood what a synod was, in short. Another issue is whether only bishops or also priests, lay people, or women can participate. In this synod, this is the first time women can participate. What does that mean? That there has been a development to live out the synodality. And this is a grace from the Lord, because synodality has to be achieved, not only at the level of the universal church, but also in the local churches, in parishes, and educational institutions. Synodality is a value of the church at all levels. It has been a very good journey. This involves another thing, the ability to discern. Synodality is a grace of the church. It is not democracy, it is something else, and it requires discernment." End quote. Now, if you haven't seen it, this past Saturday, I presented to you Cardinal Gerhard Mueller just practically denouncing synodality and tying it to the penitential rite that Pope Francis is having to kick off the synod, which involves the participants on behalf of themselves and on behalf of other Catholics who aren't even there, which is not a Catholic way of making a confession, but they were going to confess their new sins, these 7 deadly new sins that Francis just invented out of whole cloth, one of which includes sins against synodality, which are a sin against synodality would mean a sin against listening, against dialogue, against accompaniment, against discernment, whatever that means. It's a new sin that's vague and ambiguous and can be leveled at anybody because it's a new religion. That's why they invent new sins. The Pope does not have the authority to invent new sins. The faith, the magisterium of the church, and sacred scripture, sacred tradition have told us what all the sins are. We don't need to invent new ones. You can take and analyze modern problems and you can say, well, this is just this sin presented in a new way, but you cannot say this are new sins. Unfortunately, they don't seem to understand that. The synodalists, those who push this synodal nonsense, and that is what we see coming from the lips of Pope Francis himself. His vision for the church is synodality, which means listening, dialogue, acceptance, inclusion, and all the rest of it. But what's absent from there is the preaching of the gospel, calling souls to convert to Christ, and to the lack of people being called to turn their lives over to our blessed Lord. That is what's missing here. And the first law of the church is salvation of souls, which is only achieved through the recognition as Christ as Christ is Lord, and a recognition of the authority of the church that he founded, and submitting yourself to that church. Instead, they're trying to change the church. What do you think of this story? Are you that surprised that Pope Francis would say this stuff more bluntly? Instill that nice-sounding grandfatherly kind of way that he has? Let me know in the comments what you think about all this. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't, it does help. So does sharing this on social media, that helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.